Raleigh that morning, the morning of...
Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, everybody. I'm Heather Hansen, and we are showing you some of the best of the case against Zach Adams and the Holly Bobo murder. And we're doing that in preparation for the trial of Dylan Adams, which is coming up soon. We've had some motions in that case, and we wanted to go through and sort of talk about the maybe perhaps missteps that some of the defense attorney may have made and what the defense attorney in the next case may do differently. We also want to give you a programming note. At about 1:30 this afternoon, we're going to have a special about revenge porn, which has been in the news of late because of that congressman from Texas who had some of his most intimate moments out there for the public to see. We're going to have two different victims of revenge porn in here with us, and we're going to talk about the laws that are in place in the various states and how they do or do not protect victims of this type of behavior. The better term for it, according to the law, is non-consensual pornography, and we'll talk about why that is. Already on the chat rooms, we've had some questions as to, isn't revenge porn non-consensual? And it is, but there's a reason for that distinction, which we'll talk about. So be sure to tune in with us here at 1:30. In the meantime, though, I want to talk to my guest, Michel Bryant, a local attorney and one of our frequent guests here at the Law and Crime Network.
Heather, how are you?
So good to have you here.
Nice to be here.
Let's talk a little bit about this case regarding Holly Bobo's murder, because we're starting to go through the openings in this case. And I remember when I watched this, one of the problems that the chat rooms had and that I found was that it was like opening a fire hydrant with these openings, you know, just gushing information at this poor jury. And as a defense attorney in a case like this one that is so highly publicized in the community, how do you think you are best fit to approach your opening statements?
You know, what you have to remember is, and this is true of any trial and any participant in the trial on the attorney level, you are consumed by it.
Yes.
It is your
Yes.
everything, every breath from morning to night and in the dreams.
Isn't that the truth?
It is very hard to change from that kind of fire hydrant, you know, here's everything I know about it,
Yes.
to what they should know about it, they being the jury. You need to spoon feed them the important elements, the important pieces of information that you expect your case to show. And again, it's an opening statement, not an opening argument.
That's right.
So focus. You know, what is the evidence going to show? I always learned if you threw in every few sentences, the evidence will show,
Yes.
you could get away with a lot.
That's right.
You know, you can get away with a little argument if you just say, the evidence will show.
Well, let's talk about that, because I think that's an important point. Your opening is supposed to be a statement. It's supposed to be just what the evidence will show. But you're right that sometimes we lawyers use words, and I actually had this big conversation about the use of words over the weekend. We use words in such a way to try to at least make little arguments during our statement. And one of the tricks is to say the evidence will show, and then
a trick. That's what it is. A trick.
Throw in a little argument there. But I agree with you that that probably would have been a better strategy for the opening in this case. What tricks do you use so that you're not, because you have all that information in your head, to not just spew it at the jury? Is there a certain way that you make sure that you do that? Do you practice with people who don't know anything about the case?
That's a good way to do it. I mean, in terms of props, if any, you got to be off book. You know, you don't want to be on a script of any kind. Right. If you need note cards for just to hit a high point, or a flow chart always worked well for me. Same thing I used when I studied for the bar exam. Yes. You know, a flow chart that takes you logically from one step to the next, that you don't share with the jury, obviously, but it keeps you on track, keeps you on focus. Straying will kill you. You know, you'll start to wander down a rabbit hole, and then just digging your way out is tough enough for you. Imagine what the jury's doing with it. So stay focused, do whatever you need to do to maintain that focus.
Well, and to your point about props, I do think props are really helpful in a case like this one to sort of create a flow chart for the jury. And that's something you can certainly do in your opening statement, isn't that right?
Sure. I mean, visual aids are very good, whether it be at the opening statement phase, closing argument, or anything in between.
Well, and the greatest thing I have found is if you use it in your opening statement and again in your closing argument, to have some consistency and also just to show your credibility. That look what I showed you in my opening. Everything was exactly as I laid out, and here I am talking about it again in my close.
It's important, too, that the jury doesn't know the subtle distinction sometimes between demonstrative use of an exhibit and evidence.
That's right.
So in your opening, you use it as a demonstrative exhibit, and then even if it's not entered into evidence at some point, it's made an impression. And hopefully you can use it again as, quote, evidence and tell them it will be in the jury room with them when they deliberate. That's not always the case, but the fact is you got out of it right out of the box. And there it is in front of them, and they love visuals.
Right, because some things the judge will not allow back into the jury room as evidence because it may be something that I created or the other attorney created and may not actually meet the definitions under the law of evidence. But you're right, that distinction is often lost on a jury, and it's just important for them to see things with their own eyes. You know, we used to call it back in the day the dog and pony show.
Of course.
To be able to get down, if you can get a witness off the stand to use that exhibit that you made, it becomes a part of the trial.
I mean, I say this over and over again. The mantra I have is that the jury is an audience.
That's
a
it.
very important audience. But they want to be entertained. Yes, they understand their civic duty.
Yep.
They're there to hopefully do the right thing, to do justice. But let's entertain them along the way. You're telling what must be a tremendous story, or you wouldn't be here.
It's, you've got to make it a tremendous story, even if it's
I don't see a lot of boring cases go to trial, but you're right. I mean, if it is a little, you've got a business litigation case or something that's very, numbers intensive, and you got forensic accountants on the stand.
Yeah.
I mean, that can be brutal.
Yeah.
So you do have to amp up that kind of performance.
I couldn't agree with you more. And we've seen, like with Jose Baez, I think one of the reasons he's so good is because he sees it as a performance. When he was talking about riding that pony in the Aaron Hernandez closing, he was really putting on a show. There's a very well-known plaintiff's attorney in Philadelphia where I practice most often, and he puts on a CLE, or a continuing legal education thing, about trial as theater. And we oftentimes have to remember that. You ladies and gentlemen at home, you watch this every day because it is like theater. And when the good lawyers really rise on that and grasp onto that, they can do a much better job connecting with the jury.
Oh yeah, and the fact is most jurors are not Law and Crime Network type viewers.
That's right.
You might get a couple.
That's right.
But in general, you're going to get some folks who are doing the 9 to 5 at the grocery store or at an office somewhere, and they aren't savvy like our audience is.
That's right.
So you have to play to that level.
Yeah. Yeah, and in this case, we're going to go back and watch a little bit more of this defense's opening, and I want to talk to you some more about some missteps she may have made. Now, I have a trial coming up myself.
The Monday morning quarterback?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I hate that because this case is so big and so much evidence and so many missteps by the investigators, admitted missteps by the investigators, that it made her job even harder. But I'm going to play a little bit more so that we can really tune into some of the issues, and then we'll come back. So a little bit more of the defense opening in the Holly Bobo case, and we'll be back.
And from there, they began to interview everybody. For years, they worked to solve the crime, and I think that the government touched on the fact that they had interviewed and talked to and investigated this person, Terry Britt. But that is not where the case started. So first of all, there's the next door neighbor, James Barnes, who heard a scream that morning. He heard somebody screaming from the direction of the Bobo house. And James Barnes, and he lived on the next door neighbor's property with his mother, Kathy Wise. And the first that the state really looked into was James Barnes. They investigated him. They searched his whole house. They spent months and months combing over them and making the Barnes family the big suspect in their investigation. They got their phone records. They just investigated them completely. And also, in the days before Holly had disappeared, James Barnes had a friend over. His name was Keith Clark. Keith Clark had been at the house. The state investigated Keith Clark with a vigorous fury. They got his phone records. They checked into everything about him. Then the next person that the state turned an eye against was John Dodd. John Dodd was a grandson of some people that lived down the road from where Holly lived. Somebody that morning said that they had spotted him in his white pickup truck right there in the area, and he had a four-wheeler also in the area, and there was some talk that maybe the person that took Holly had gone through the woods on a four-wheeler with her, and so they turned to all their investigative powers on James Dodd, and they absolutely tore his life up. It was hard on him because he suddenly became the suspect that everybody was looking at as the one who had taken Holly Bobo. And in a community that small, and everybody so very, very interested in what had happened to Holly, and people were genuinely very concerned about what had happened to Holly, that then they all rumors and just what was going on just spread like wildfire. So as soon as one person is rumored to have been involved, it was terrible. But the law enforcement investigations did all kinds of affidavits to get things on John Dodd. They searched his computers, they searched his telephone, they looked at his Facebook page, they were looking at his car, they investigated all of his property. As a matter of fact, they even had dogs that hid on his property and had allegedly traced Holly Bobo's scent to his driveway, or his grandparents' driveway. So he was thoroughly investigated at some point. Then there was another person who was investigated thoroughly, Blake Barnett. And they turned all their attention to Blake Barnett. And at one point, we're putting a lot of energy into him. Next, they looked at Terry and Janet Britt. The state of Tennessee looked at Terry and Janet Britt. They really investigated them. They got subpoenas. They searched their house. They did wiretaps on them. They looked at them very closely. However, through the wiretaps and through the subpoenas, and they even put listening devices in their house, they lived in a trailer, they had a metal roof, they were never able to get any type of, quote, confession from them. What they were wanting was some type of confession, some type of discussion between the couple where they were acknowledging, perhaps, that they had done this. They weren't able to get that, even though they did get a lot of circumstantial evidence in that case. Then law enforcement turned to Jerry Evans. Jerry Evans was a man that lived down the road near Five Forks, just down the road from Holly's house. And they turned to this man, Jerry Evans. They did thorough search on his house. They did all kinds of affidavits on him to get all kinds of information. They looked at him. There's another man who may or may not come to testify in this case, named Michael Alexander. At one point, they were very suspicious that Michael Alexander was involved in it. There's another man that they investigated, Jason Nickel. And the morning that Holly disappeared, and the case has been an absolute fire hydrant of information coming in. But one of the things they did is they got all the cell phone records from all the cell phone towers where Holly Bobo's cell phone pinged that morning. They got all the records of everybody else's phone who pinged at the same time her phone did. Jason Nickel came up as a person who was a registered sex offender. His phone pinged that morning, and his wife's phone also pinged that morning on 2 different towers where Holly's phone was. They investigated Jason Nickel. As a matter of fact, he had a potential possible kidnapping of another woman 1 week to the day earlier. And he'd also had he had accosted several women at the Hickory Mall, the old Hickory Mall in Jackson, Tennessee. So they turned their focus on Jason Nickel at some point. And then, of course, one of the more tragic things that the state did is they turned their investigation on Clint Bobo. At some point, the Bobos retained an attorney to represent Clint because the state of Tennessee was absolutely determined to show that Clint Bobo was somehow involved in this case. And they got all kinds of records on the Bobo. They got phone records. They oftentimes treated the Bobo family as though they were involved, limiting any kind of information that they shared with the Bobo family because they were treating them as though they were suspects in this case. And so all of that came up, and yet at the end of the Clint Bobo they really focused on at the end of 2012, all of this is transpired, and now as they're heading into 2013, and they're in the fall of 2013 headed into 2014, it's been 2.5, almost 3 years, and they still do not have a suspect that they can firmly go after. They don't have anybody that they've narrowed it down at this point as to who it is that has committed this crime. And at this point, and as it's been said many times by the TBI, this was the most expensive and most exhaustive investigation in the history of the state of Tennessee. And yet, when they came to 2013, they had nothing. They had a great big goose egg. They paid all this money, and they had...
Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. We are watching the openings of the defense attorney in the case against Zach Adams for the murder of Holly Bobo. And Michael and I are sitting here sort of marveling at the amount of information that she is giving
yes.
One of the things that she's trying to do here is to point out all of the different directions law enforcement went in other than after her client, and how long it took to sort of go after her client. This seems to me, Michael, like a perfect time to do what you had suggested and use some sort of a visual.
Of course. I mean, again, this is the first blush that this jury is getting to these arguments, the statement of the evidence. And if they're not allowed to take notes, and we know that's court specific, sometimes a judge won't let them take notes during an opening or a closing. I don't understand that. Seems to me that shows they're focused, and it will help them down the road, help create their own version of a roadmap, which is what the attorney is supposed to be doing.
Now, I know, let me just interrupt you there, because I know in the jurisdictions where I practice, they won't allow note-taking during openings and closings because it's not evidence. And so, you know, we often say that in our openings and closings, we say what I say is not evidence, the only evidence you hear is coming from the... So some courts, I think, say, you know, that's not evidence, you don't get to take notes for that, but it certainly would help.
Of course. Well, in this case, you know, how many names, how many people, how many places can you throw out and expect the jurors to grasp what that all means? You know, she's telling them things that may make sense to some degree when they're done.
Later,
but I mean, it's a tricky mental skill to be able to just put those aside, leave them hanging in the gray matter somewhere, and then when they come up during the court's trial, go, oh yeah, remember she said that's the person who did. No, you've got to either visually reinforce it or focus.
Right.
You can make a point that the cops have looked at X number of people and they didn't do it very well, and they just were desperate to find the right guy, and that's how they got me. But you have to be able to focus on the ones that are most important.
Right. Or use the numbers. I think your point is great to say 77 people had been, that's a big number, right?
Sure,
and so that might strike the jury, but to go through all 77 in your opening can run the risk of being a distraction.
And I think the attorney needs to be, you know, like any other audience, you need to know, to know the room, you know?
That's right.
And if they start glazing over, probably a good idea to either move on or do something to re-engage them.
That's right. And the other thing, there's a couple of visuals that I'm now imagining as if I were trying this case. One is to do a chronology, like a timeline of just, this is the day that Holly Bobo disappeared, and these are all the things that happened before they ever got to my client. That could be effective. And then also something, you know, some of the best visuals I've seen are, for example, if you're talking about the number of states that an expert testifies in, to put a pin in each state so that the entire United States looks full of pins.
Yes, you have to make sure you got a lot of pins.
That's right. It's got to be worth it. It's got to be more than 25 to really make it worth it. But those types of visuals are even more striking. Or talking about blood loss, I've once seen a plaintiff's attorney bring in a 2-liter bottle of Coke and say it was this much blood loss. That's a great visual as well.
Sure, anything that can bring it back to something they can touch, you know, even if it's a mental tacitness, you know, they want to feel engaged.
That's right. And then the more senses that you can use, the better off. You know, they spend so much time, these poor jurors, with their ears, you know, and not seeing a whole lot. You see people, but not seeing a whole lot as far as, you know, pictures or diagrams or any of those types of things. And then if you can go one step further, sometimes we actually allow the jury to touch the thing, like if it has to do with, some of my cases are knee replacements, to hold the prosthetic in their hand. Again, the more senses, the better.
No doubt about it.
Well, you know, it's going to be interesting to see in so many ways. And as we go through this afternoon, I want to talk to you about how the case with Dylan Adams may be different. And one of the ways, perhaps, is to really focus in the opening and bring everything in a very concise and focused way rather than being all over the place.
And important in his case because the crime he's really accused of is much more finite. It was sort of the end.
That's right.
And a lot of the foundational stuff, important, but maybe not what you want to focus on.
Well, and also the other difference in his case is death penalty, as far as I can recall, is no longer on the table. So now it's, it's things are much more focused. The nice thing about being second in line is you can learn from, we can Monday morning quarterback,
Yep.
and they could watch Law and Crime Network if they want to,
Yes.
and then really, try to learn from perhaps not the mistakes, but the missteps from the first attorney.
Sure, you got a second whack at it,
That's right.
and who wouldn't benefit from that?
That's right. Going second is oftentimes a real advantage. But we will return you to the continued opening of the defense attorney, and then we'll be back with Michael in just a minute.
The citizens of Decatur County, the family of Holly Bobo, and the public at large all wanted answers to how such a crime could happen, how the police could be involved right away, and still, after all the resources and all the information they had, they could have absolutely nobody charged by that point. And it's also important to keep in mind that in the beginning of 2014 is an election year. Who's coming up for re-election in 2014? The district attorney. The district attorney who is in office, who'd been in office for a while, Hansel McAdams. He is coming up for re-election. Who else is coming up for re-election? The sheriff of Decatur County Sheriff, because at that time, actually, all the judges, all the district attorneys, and all the law enforcement is all coming up for re-election. So there's some additional pressure at that point. And Matt Stowe has just announced that he will be running against Hansel McAdams for District Attorney General of the 24th Judicial District. So what happens at this point? And the Bobo family had been estranged at some point this time from the TBI. So the Bobos reached out to a person that they knew, a man named Dennis Benjamin, who went to their family church. And he was a retired police officer through Memphis. He was a retired Memphis police officer. So the Bobos reached out to him. And many people had been volunteering to try to help the Bobos also. But this Dennis Benjamin came forward and was wanting to try to help the family. So Mr. Benjamin went around and made some inquiries as to what was going on. And definitely one of the people's names who had come up, or several people's names had come up in the investigation, and it was Jason Autry, Zach Adams, Shane Austin. Their names had come up because, as I said, there were lots and lots of people's names who had come up during the investigation. But one of the people, and there's a man named Victor Dinsmore, and one of the things that Victor Dinsmore specifically told, because Victor Dinsmore has a past rape conviction. And so Victor Dinsmore was one of the people that the police had looked at and lived close to where the body was, where they eventually found Holly Bobo's body. But Victor Dinsmore lived over there. Victor Dinsmore lived on Yellow Springs Road, and on the east side of his home and on the west side of his home, they found some of Holly Bobo's personal property thrown out on the road. And Victor Dinsmore tells Dennis Benjamin, well, I think that maybe Zach Adams did it. Victor Dinsmore had heard that Zach Adams was trying to use Victor Dinsmore as a alibi for that day, and Victor was disturbed at that point. I think he was erroneously told that Zach Adams had used him as an alibi, but one of the law enforcement had told him that. So at that point, he grew irritated. He said, I think that you ought to try to look at Zach Adams. And he says, Zach Adams has a brother. If you want to get anywhere with this case, what you need to do is talk to Zach Adams' brother. Because Zach Adams has a brother named Dylan Adams. And I want to be politically correct here. I want to say things, I don't want to be offensive, but Dylan Adams has a low IQ. He has low intelligence. All through elementary school and high school, he was in special education classes. He was, he has low intelligence, and he also has some problems processing information. He's not very smart. And so Victor Dinsmore even says to Dennis Benjamin, you know, it's the brother is not very smart. And, you know, he's a slow brother, and if you want to get anywhere with this, you need to go talk to him. So, at some point, and the case is complicated. Again, like I said, there's a lot of people involved, a lot of information. But at some point, it turns out that Hansel McAdams, and this is before the election, Hansel McAdams has a woman, an assistant district attorney that works for him. Her name is Beth Hall. And Beth Hall works as a part-time state prosecutor for the district attorney's office. And she works part-time as a federal prosecutor, and she works for the federal United States Attorney's Office, prosecuting federal crimes. So Dylan Adams has been charged in a series of federal crimes, federal drug crimes. Dylan has not been convicted of a felony, and however, he's arrested along with a friend of his. The friend is a felon, and he's arrested in possession of some weapons. And so Dylan is arrested then on some very serious gun charges relating to the fact that his friend is a felon and is in possession of a weapon, and Dylan may or may not have supplied weapons. I think they're arrested for burglary of the friend's mother's house. They broke into the mother's house and took some guns from her. And so they're arrested on these charges. The prosecutor in this case is Beth Hall, who's also the assistant prosecutor and working on the disappearance of Holly Bobo. So she there. So she charges Dylan through the United States Attorney's Office on some federal gun charges. And Dylan is in federal custody in trial on those charges. And the most amazing thing happens. Dylan, who is facing 120 months, and that's federal talk, it's 10-year sentence, but he's facing 120 months. And this is a crime, the crimes he is facing are crimes that you cannot get probation for. Probation is not allowed on those crimes. If you are convicted of those crimes, those are going to be sentences to serve in federal prison. And federal prison does not have a parole system. And so the most amazing thing happens. Dylan Adams has a guilty plea. He pleads guilty to these federal charges. He is pleads to lesser charges. They modify the charges. He is released with no jail prison sentence to serve at all. He's released on a supervised release. But one of the conditions of his release is that he must go live with Dennis Benjamin. This is a condition that is agreed to by Beth Hall, the United States Attorney. At the time, Dylan Adams had a federal attorney who he had switched. Different people within the Federal Defender Services were representing him, but he had an attorney who had agreed to this, and Jeff Jackson, who's one of the prosecutors in this case, Brent Booth and who's the TBI investigators, two of the lead TBI investigators in this case, Jeff Jackson and Brent Booth. Both are very aware of the fact that Dylan Adams is now going to go live with Dennis Benjamin, a friend of the Bobo family who has been investigating the disappearance of Holly. And at this time, they've already had a series of interviews with Dylan Adams. And most of those, they've had a series of interrogations, with Dylan Adams. Most of those interrogations have been where Dylan had no attorney present. So they've taken this man who has low IQ. They've had multiple, perhaps even as many as 15 interrogations with the police. They've used the information that Dylan's been giving them, or the information that they've gotten through interrogations, to go ahead and get an indictment started on Zach Adams, and that's in the spring of 2014. They've gotten a basic indictment for homicide. This is before.
Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. We are watching the opening of the defense attorney in the case involving the murder of Holly Bobo, but against Zach Adams in preparation for the case that's coming up against Dylan Adams. And we just heard, Michael, some comments about Dylan Adams. Has that given you any sort of clue as to how you would defend Dylan Adams in the upcoming case?
Critical information about his mental capabilities or lack thereof.
That's right.
I mean, whether it be on a sympathetic level or forming the intent level.
That's right.
There are many things you can do with a defendant that has some diminished mental capacity.
Absolutely, and especially now that someone has already been made to pay for these crimes, now you can really almost get some sympathy for your defendant, which is unusual in these types of terrible criminal cases.
Right, and he's going to be, allegedly the guy who pulled the trigger to truly end Holly Bobo's life. So
right.
that's a tough one. There is a statement I recall hearing first time around from a witness who said that Zach, the convicted defendant, would put Dylan in a hole alongside Holly if he ever spoke out.
Right.
So if that is some evidence of their relationship, of who was running the show,
right.
that helps Dylan in this case.
Without a doubt, without a doubt. I mean, I would much rather be defending Dylan, given all of these circumstances, than to be the poor person that had to handle defending Zach. Because not only do you have a stronger case against Zach, but you've got to be the first to put all this stuff forward, and you have a client who certainly seems to have been running the show, no matter how you think that show sort of went.
Yeah, no, I think that's very helpful, and you got to use what you can use when you're handling a defense of such a horrible case like this. And I think the defense going forward with the Dylan case is going to have a lot more to play with.
Absolutely, and we're going to watch the very last bit of the defense attorney's openings, and then we'll start getting into some of the witnesses. Some of the witnesses will be the same in the case against Dylan. In fact, I think the first witness, which just happens to be Holly's father, will likely be heard from in that second trial. So we'll want to listen to their testimony and how it might play in the case against Dylan. So for right now, we'll continue in the opening of the defense attorney, and we'll be right back.
An indictment for homicide. Dylan is then released in August of 2014 to go live with Dennis Benjamin, a man that Dylan Adams does not know. He's not related to Dylan Adams. He's not a friend of Dylan Adams. He is released to go live with Dennis Benjamin. So Dylan goes to live with Dennis, and 5 weeks later, after having lived with Dennis Benjamin, Dennis calls the 911 system and announces over the 911 to the 911 operator, I have somebody at my house who's here wanting to confess to the murder of Holly Bobo and what happened to Holly Bobo. So they bring Dylan in for additional questioning. This time they videotape it. They videotape what's said. And based on what Dylan says at this during this interrogation, they then get their indictment. This is when they get their next indictment, an indictment for the rape, the murder, and the kidnapping of Holly Bobo. And it's after this final session with Dylan Adams that they go ahead and they file their notice of death penalty. So now they have several people charged. They have charged Jason Autry. They go ahead and charge Dylan Adams with rape, murder, and kidnapping of Holly Bobo. And they charge Zach Adams with this. So now they have their indictments and they file their notice of death penalty. Well, turns out that there's some really big problems with this. One of the really big problems is that when they were getting Dylan Adams to do all this confessing, a lot of what he's confessed to doesn't match the physical evidence. After all, when they first start talking to Dylan Adams, they haven't done any searches on the Zach Adams property. Really, Zach Adams has a house that he inherited when his father died. It's right next door to his grandfather's house, and he owns it in part with his brother Dylan. But Dylan lives with the grandfather because Dylan's really not up to living on his own. So he lives, but they all live at the end of the same driveway in a very close to each other. And so after Dylan begins to talk to them first, while he's still in federal jail awaiting federal charges, they go ahead and they get extensive search warrants to search that property, and a lot of it was even broadcast on TV. They had helicopters out there. And you'll hear testimony in this trial about all of the searches they did. They went through Zach Adams' house and they took over 500 items out of that house. They took all the material off of all the mattresses. They took giant chunks of carpeting out of that house. They took whole pieces of furniture, upholstered chairs, leather couches, all kinds of ottomans and pillows and blankets and shelving. They went in to Zach Adams' house, and in the living room, they cut a hole in the floor that's as big as a car. And they took that floor down to the joists. I mean, you can see dirt. So they took the flooring out. They took the vinyl flooring that was under the wood floor. They took the subflooring out, and they left a hole to the dirt in that house. They took over 500 objects. They brought in backhoes. They searched through Dick Adams' house. They searched some property across the street. They seized, I think they seized 3 cars from the Adams family. 4 cars. They seized 4 cars from the Adams family and went through all the cars. Through everything. They also got all kinds of cell phone, telephone records from them. They had terabytes of discovery in this case to provide, just of all the information that they had. Well, turns out the state has a terrible problem in this case. And their terrible problem is that the story that Dylan Adams has told does not match the physical evidence in the case. Because after they finished going through that whole house, there's no DNA that matches Holly to the house. There are no fingerprints that match Holly to the house or to the cars. There's no hair from Holly that matches Holly to Mr. Adams' house. And the cell phone records don't jive with what it is that Dylan Adams says that day. So now the state, by now there's been an election. Hansel McAdams is out. Matt Stowe has been elected. And then at some point, Matt Stowe has declined or recused himself. And the Memphis District Attorney's Office has been brought in. You know, the Memphis District Attorney's Office didn't start this case, but they've been brought in to finish the case. And so at this point then, the state has a problem. And the problem is they have a story from a man with his special education from school. The story doesn't jive with the evidence, and they are going to have...
Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm here with Michel Bryant, and we're watching the bits and pieces of the Holly Bobo case, the case against Zach Adams. In just a minute, we'll be watching some of the witnesses, and I want to talk to you about how that will play out. But first, I want to talk about the trial that we hope to be starting tomorrow here at the Law and Crime Network. I know that our trial watchers are eager to see what's next, and so I want to talk a little bit about what's next.
Sure.
We're calling this the Cloud 9 murder trial. What's your understanding of why that is?
It's a nightclub of sorts.
Yes.
I guess it's in Florida, near Orlando or Ocala.
That's
Ocala.
right, Ocala.
And you know, anytime we have one of these incidents that takes place in a nightclub or a night spot, lots of stuff is going on.
Oh, for sure.
I mean, talk about needing a flow chart. Now you're going to need a flow chart. We got location issues, we've got suspect issues, we got witness issues, and ultimately what we have is an altercation that began in a nightclub, spilled out onto the street, and one of those involved in the altercation decided this is a great time to whip out my gun.
That's right.
And fire it in the air, and then maybe just fire it randomly at people.
Yeah, and it sounds as though one of the victims actually died. That victim is Benitria Robinson, and it sounds as though that victim may have actually just been an innocent bystander, which, you know, we'll hear more about starting tomorrow, but that's certainly a tragedy, even worse than had that person been, you know, sort of in the fight and in the scrum of it all.
Right, and it's a little vague as to what if any, involvement she had. But when you have somebody just indiscriminately firing a gun out in a parking lot near a club, that's going to happen.
There's 1 count of second-degree homicide with a firearm for the death of Benitria Robinson. There's 5 counts of attempted second-degree homicide with a firearm. Nathaniel Kendrick, Daniel D.D. Kendrick, Donatarius Bartley, Tomia Wadley, and Danvist Blunt. They were all shot, but they all survived. And so those witnesses will be testifying at this trial. Compelling stuff, right,
my
Michael?
gosh, yes. I mean, that's you don't often have that level of recipient witnesses.
Right.
I mean, that's going to be some good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, interesting testimony, having been there themselves. Nathaniel Kendrick was shot in the head and shoulder. D.D. Kendrick was shot in the back, as was Donatarius Bartley, and then the other 2 were shot in the leg. So, you know, certainly, and they'll talk also about their damages and the way that this has impacted them going forward, which can also be very compelling testimony to a jury.
It's going to be dramatic. It's going to be scary. Because most folks can put themselves in the position of people in a nightclub at some point in their lives.
Absolutely.
And so to just try and make the jurors especially feel that fear is going to be very important.
And to your point, it might be effective for the defense attorney to sort of lay out a timeline during the opening and have some sort of visual to keep all of these various defendants and where they were during different points of the night in place. So we'll continue to bring you some details on that case as we have them. It's our understanding that jury selection is occurring today. They hope to get a jury today and to begin openings on that case tomorrow. We will have it for you here at the Law and Crime Network. And in the meantime, we are going back and looking at one of our more recent cases and also one of our most compelling cases. This Holly Bobo case, I mean, it's one of those, Michael, and I know you did some time at Court TV. It's one of those cases that just resonates with people because she was missing for so long and had such a difficult time solving this crime.
Right, and when the facts became public, you know, it's a horrible story. You know, rape and murder and collusion by brothers and relatives.
Right.
And, no, it is like Shakespeare.
Yeah, and the story that Jason Autry told, Jason Autry, who was a defendant and then had some sort of immunity, at least federal immunity for his testimony. I mean, the story that he told didn't just implicate Zach Adams. It implicated Clint Bobo as someone who he was teaching how to make meth. It implicated Holly Bobo's cousin as someone that Zach Adams was dating and perhaps getting Holly involved in their relationship. I mean, he really laid it all out there in this case.
Oh, yeah, and critical to the conviction of Zach Adams was that testimony. Obviously, the jury didn't feel that whatever deal he had gotten or was in the process of getting tarnished his testimony. They believed him.
Yeah, and that's always the risk you play on both sides of having a witness who has immunity. Because the prosecution, we see in so many of our cases, I mean, I keep going back to the Aaron Hernandez case, but so many of our cases that you see one person get immunity and then that person either makes or breaks the case against the defendant.
Sure. Yeah, and you know, it's common to attack their credibility because, hey, you got a deal.
Right,
of course you're going to say whatever the prosecution wants. You got a deal. Well, the jury's smart enough to figure that out. Did it weigh on them to testify? Probably. But did it weigh on them enough to lie? That's the jury's decision.
Well, we're going to continue to look at this case and look at the case against Zach Adams and looking at it forward to see how we think the case against Dylan Adams will play. We're also going to be here. Michael's going to stay with me while we bring in our guests about the revenge porn segment, which is really more about non-consensual pornography. And there is a difference. You've had so many great questions about what are the definitions, who owns these types of pictures, what about First Amendment rights. All of these questions have been coming in, and we're going to answer those for you this afternoon and also speak to people who have been personally affected by these types of issues and talk about what can be done in the future to protect yourselves and to protect yourself under the law. But for right now, we'll return to the testimony of Holly Bobo's father. He was the first witness called in the case against Zach Adams.
Wednesday, wasn't it?
Wednesday morning.
Hey, did you work that day?
Yes.
Hey, what time did you get up to go to work?
5:30.
You got up at 5:30 to be at work at what time?
6:30.
All right. So when you got up that morning, was Karen already up or did she get up after you?
She got up. I got a little routine where I feed the dogs and stuff like that, and then I'll take my shower. And I met her as I was getting close to being ready to leave the house to go to work. I met her in the house.
When you say you met her in the house, meaning you passed by her?
Yeah, hallway or whatever.
So she had gotten up while you were in the shower?
Yes.
Did you see Holly that morning?
I didn't see her that morning.
Do you know where she was in your house?
I knew where she was because the bathroom is across the room from her door, and I seen her light on as I come out of the shower, getting ready to go to work.
And did you, when you noticed her light under the door, did you say anything to her?
I spoke to her. I asked her if she needed any lunch money or anything that day, or gas money or whatever, and she said yes. And I said, I'll leave you a $20 bill on the kitchen bar.
After having that, I guess, exchange with Holly, how did you end the conversation?
That pretty much ended the conversation with Holly that morning.
Did you tell her bye?
Yeah, I told her bye and I loved her. That's just normal for our house.
So after you told Holly goodbye and I love you, did you go and put the 20 in the kitchen?
Yes.
Where you told her you did?
Yes,
Is that the first time you've done something like that? Or
No,
is that kind
no
of routine?
ma'am. I do that I've done that all the time.
And did you go into work?
Yes.
And when you left your house that morning, which door did you leave?
The front door. I always use the front door of the house.
And where did you park?
I usually parked out front. I don't park mine in a garage.
And I'm going to ask you some questions about where people in your family parked in a minute. Are you the only person that was parking in the front at that time, parking your truck?
Yeah.
So everybody else was in the back?
Yeah.
How far from your house to McKenzie Tree Service?
Probably about, I'm going to guess 5 miles.
And when you got to work, did you all stay there at McKenzie Tree Service, or did you and a crew go somewhere else? Because you said you were a mower.
Yeah, when we get there, what we normally do, we'll fuel up our truck for our machine, our pickups that we're driving to work. We'll fuel them up, and if we have to pick up any parts we need that day to work with, we get them. We're usually there like 30, 40 minutes in the morning. That's why we get there a little early before we leave out.
All right, so did y'all go somewhere?
Yeah.
Where did you go?
We went to, at that time, we was working on the other side of Linden, leaving Linden, probably about 5 miles. I think it's east, going toward Louisville, Tennessee.
And did you drive your personal vehicle, or did you take a company truck?
No, we always took a company truck.
So you said this work site you were at was in Linden?
It was about 5 miles. I think it's east of Linden, toward Louisville.
And were y'all supposed to work there all day long?
Yes.
Did you actually stay at that work site all day long? Or
No, ma'am.
You got to let me finish. Or did something happen?
No, something happened.
I'm not going to ask you what time, because I assume you weren't, keeping up down to the minute. Was it before or very long when something happened, or was it pretty early?
It was early on in the morning.
What happened?
I got a phone call. I can't tell you exactly what time. I got a phone call from Terry Brumley.
Okay, let me ask you this. Terry Brumley?
Yes, Terry Brumley is my...
Is Terry Brumley here in the courtroom too?
Yeah.
Okay, so you got a phone call from somebody named Terry Brumley.
Yes.
Was that usual or commonplace for Miss Brumley to call you?
No, ma'am.
All right. So what happened?
I got a phone call from her, and I had some guys around me there talking, and she told me that I needed to come back home because Holly had been taken. And I said, what? And it was a guy beside me talking, and I had to holler at him and tell him to quieten down, or I forgot what I said, but he quietened down. And she told me for the second time, and she was crying when she told me the second time. And I understood it the second time what she said. Holly had been taken.
Holly has been taken.
Yeah.
4 words.
Yeah.
What sort of an impact did Holly has been taken have on you at that moment?
That was the worst feeling you could possibly feel. That something bad has happened to one of your kids.
So you're out there outside of Linden without your own car. Dana, what did you do?
I have a what you call a point man that he usually drives me to work and back in a single cab company truck. And I hollered at Danny, he's the one that drove me, and I told him that I forgot what the word was. He had to carry me back to the office quick.
And so, did he drive you back to McKenzie Tree Service?
Yes, ma'am.
Were y'all going slow or y'all going fast?
He was going so fast in that Chevrolet truck that the motor was cutting off and back on. We passed everything from work back to Parsons, McKenzie.
Other than those 4 words, Holly has been taken. Did you have any more information?
That's it.
So that whole trip back to McKenzie, you didn't know anything?
Didn't know anything. I wanted to know, but I didn't.
So when you got back to your office, what did you do?
I got in my truck. I think I hollered and told Danny to tell Dennis, my boss at the time, what was going on. And I run from the company truck and got in mine and went home the back way. It's the quickest way I know to get back to the house.
This time you were alone. And did you see at some point whether somebody was following you or not?
Yes, as soon as I was pulling out from McKenzie Tree Service, my boss, Dennis McKenzie, was in his pickup right on my bumper. My boss, like.
You said you took the back way home. You know, we're sitting in Hardin County and people aren't familiar with maybe the roads and back there. Are these very populated roads, or are they deserted roads, gravel roads, narrow roads, winding roads?
Some of them, they're definitely winding roads, and some of them narrow roads. One of them is a popular road.
When you got close to your house, did you notice or see something that was going on that you had never seen before?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you explain to the jury what you saw?
Before I even got to the house, I could see the yard where I was coming in. The yard's on the left in the direction I come in. I don't know, I'm gonna guess 50 to 100 people. The road was full of cars. It was cop cars, it was regular cars. The yard was full of people, cops and people. And I had to drive on past her. I was in a terrible big hurry, and I had to drive on past all that and go down on the side of the road where the county used to park their work equipment, and I had to park down there and run back to the house.
Now, is that because the road you live on is one of the narrow roads?
It's a very narrow road in front of our house.
I'm sorry?
In front of our house, it's a very narrow road.
The Swine Johnson Road was so narrow, cars are already lined up, you had to actually pass.
I had to kind of weave in between them to get past them where I could pull over somewhere and park.
So,
Yeah, run back to the house.
you said run back to the house. Did you run fast as you
I
could?
run as fast as I can go.
And as you got down the road and hit your driveway, did you have a plan? I mean, did you even know what you were going to do, supposed to do?
The only thing I was thinking is get back up to the house and see somebody else, family member or somebody that tell me more about what I had heard had happened.
Do you remember who the first person you saw was once you ran up the driveway?
I saw a lot of people, and some of them was friends and neighbors, some of them was cops that I guess I knew. The first person I saw that I thought I needed to talk to was my son, Clint.
I'm not going to ask you what Clint said, but after you talked to Clint, do you remember the very next thing you did?
I talked to Clint and left him, and I'm pretty sure that Terry Brumley was the next person that I seen that I thought would have some information for me.
Okay.
And I talked to her.
All right. And again, I'm not going to ask you what Ms. Brumley said, but after you talked to Terry Brumley, what's the next thing that you did?
I saw Karen and I talked to her.
All right. So now you talked to Clint, Ms. Brumley who called you,
Yep.
and Karen.
Yeah.
Then what did you do?
I went from Karen and straight into the front door of the house, and I went inside and I found my pistol, and I come back outside with the pistol.
Was the pistol loaded?
Yes, ma'am.
What was it? What were you?
9mm Beretta.
You said there were cops all over the place. Did anybody try to take your gun away from you?
No, ma'am.
You just had it.
I had it in my hand. I didn't even own a holster for it at the time.
And how long did you wander around your yard with a loaded pistol in your hand that morning?
I don't know how long, but it seemed like hours.
Initially, you said there were 50 to 100 people. Did more people just keep coming and coming and coming?
It seemed like there was more coming.
Do you remember what all or what agencies were represented by law enforcement? You said there were some local ones. Did other agencies come as well?
Yes, several more agencies that morning come.
Did TBI come?
TBI was there.
Did FBI come?
FBI was there. U.S. Marshals was there.
So U.S. Marshals, FBI, TBI.
A SWAT team. I remember them pulling up.
Were there helicopters in the air that morning?
Somebody told us, yes, there was a helicopter come in and circle the house and sit down on the pond levee.
How much property do you own around your house?
Sit down on
the pond levee. We have a pond to the right side of our house, and it sit down over there. It's an open place for it to sit down.
And I should have already asked, how many acres do you own?
23.
Okay, and that's all right there around that house?
Yes.
Were people wandering around in your front yard, your backyard, your house, your woods?
It was people wandering, standing, fiddling, just like nobody.
It's all right.
I told him, if y'all think one of us done it, I was talking about me and Clint and Karen that was still left there. I said, if y'all think one of us done it, 10 of y'all stay here with us and the rest of you go do something. And it probably wasn't that nice of words when I said it.
But you wanted somebody to do something.
Yes, ma'am.
You wanted Holly
Yes,
back.
immediately.
Your Honor, I'll pass forward a photograph previously shown to defense counsel.
Okay.
Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Heather Hansen, and we are sitting here watching bits and pieces of the trial against Zach Adams for the murder and rape and other kidnapping of Holly Bobo. We just heard compelling testimony from her father. Do you think that they'll call him again in this second trial?
I can't imagine not using him as a setup witness.
Right.
You know, it'd be nice to get family members to testify in a case in chief, but if it's just for sympathetic purposes, it's not going to work.
That's right.
They have to have something to bring to the table,
right.
something that's important to tell the story. In this case, you get the bonus of that sympathetic element.
Absolutely. And the father does bring, the circumstances and the discovery of her being missing and so forth to the table. And what a difficult thing for this family. One of the chatters said, to have this family go through this again. And you see how, and in a minute we'll hear from Holly's mother, which is even more upsetting and sort of visceral. But you see how very upsetting this is for him from a strategy perspective. If you're the prosecutor, good idea to call these witnesses first?
I do think so. Again, it helps lay the foundation for the overall story. It's not technical stuff. It's regular guy stuff.
Right. That's right.
You don't want to immerse them in the some of the minutia of experts and blood and all.
DNA, cell phones.
No, let's give them the story first. And to hear this guy, and I've heard this before, obviously, come out of his house after he's learned that his daughter is missing at this point. That's what he knows. He's got a gun in his hand, and all of the law enforcement agencies possible in Tennessee. And nobody seems to have a problem with that.
Right.
Is that a Tennessee thing or what?
Well, and the fact that they thought he did it, and so he said, some of you stay with me, that's fine, but the rest of you start searching, start doing something. I mean, gosh, how helpless he must have felt. From a trial strategy perspective, though, that whole idea of primacy and recency, the first thing the jury hears and the last thing they hear, it's why openings and closings are so important, but also those witnesses. If you can, and it's not always easy to arrange your witnesses the way you want to.
Right. A lot of people don't understand, enough Law and Order TV episodes, and they think, hey, it's all done in 52 minutes.
That's right.
But it's, you try to be respectful of witnesses' schedules. Maybe they have practical problems. They're out of state. Transportation issues. It can be very difficult to put on a linear story.
Absolutely. And the great thing with having victims and families and so forth is they're there every day. So they can certainly be used in a way that you want to use them for your strategy, and then also to fill when the experts don't come in and that type of thing.
Right.
So this was, I think, a very effective way to start the case with Holly Bobo's father. In just a minute, we're going to hear from Holly Bobo's mother, but first, the prosecution next called a neighbor who heard some screams and so forth. Again, do you think that that was a smart way to sort of chronologically attack this huge case?
Of course, something like this is a timeline-specific case, and so if you've got things that can punctuate that timeline, that's a great idea, and the witness can do that.
So this next witness is James Barnes, and he was a neighbor, and we're going to hear his testimony. It's about 8 minutes, and then we'll be back to discuss. And remember, at about 1:30, we're going to be doing our special on non-consensual pornography or revenge porn. Here in New York City, a law has recently been passed, or at least has taken steps towards being passed, and there has been some action. Facebook has actually stepped up and said that there's some things that they're going to do to try to help with this type of thing. Different states have different rules, and given what happened with Representative Barton, one of the congressmen for Texas, we thought it was a good time to sort of go over all of this, explain what the laws are in various states, what your recourse may be if you experience something like this, and what we expect from the law going forward. So all of that's coming up at about 1:30. For right now, we're going to go back to James Barnes, one of the Bobo's neighbors, who heard screams on the day that Holly Bobo disappeared.
And how long have you lived in Darton?
About 14 years now.
Do you know a family by the name of the Bobo family that lived on Swan Johnson Road?
Yes, I live next door.
And when you lived next door, did that encompass a period of time in 2011?
Yeah.
And I asked you about the Bobo family in general. You know that the husband and father in the house was Dana Bobo?
Yes, ma'am.
And the mother was who?
Karen.
Karen. And do you know their children by any chance?
Clint and Holly.
Okay. You didn't go to school with them, did you?
No, ma'am.
Right. Was your relationship basically just knew them because they were your neighbors?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. You didn't socialize with them? You weren't going back and forth grilling out or anything like that? No. I want to draw your attention to probably about 7:45 in the morning approximately on April the 13th of 2011 and ask whether you were home that morning.
Yes, ma'am.
And you said you lived next door to the Bobos. Is that next door like you can reach out and touch your neighbor, or is there some distance between the houses?
It's about 750 feet.
Okay. And who all lived at your house or on your property?
At the time, just me and my ex-wife, Cassie Bates.
Was there a child there as well?
Yes, Ever. I'm sorry.
And was it a young child?
Yes.
A baby?
He
Toddler?
was 4, I think. 4 or 5.
And did your mother stay around there as well?
Yeah, I don't think she had moved off at the time yet.
So what does that mean? You don't think she had moved off?
Yes, she moved up here to Lawrence County.
Okay. So at that time, though,
I think she was still there.
on the property.
Yeah.
Right.
But she wasn't currently there that morning, though.
She was not?
No.
Okay. But there are 2 places that you could live there, like a trailer
Yes, ma'am.
and a house? Which one did you stay in with your ex-wife?
The trailer.
Couldn't hear you.
The trailer.
When your mom, when she was there, did she stay in the house?
Yes.
And were they close to one another?
Yeah.
In addition to the trailer and the house, were there any other, buildings or there on your property, like a barn or a shed or anything?
Not
like
at the
that?
time, I don't think.
I'm sorry?
Not at the time.
Okay. And you're going to have to speak up because I'm having trouble hearing.
I'm sorry.
It's all right. Get in this big room and your voice kind of goes away. Were you working at the time?
Yes, ma'am.
Where did you work?
For myself.
Doing what kind of work?
Construction contracting.
And were you in the middle of a project that April?
Yes.
And did that cause you to get up and leave normal time, 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you and your ex-wife have one or more cars?
Just one.
Right, and because you had one car, does that mean y'all shared one? In other words, you would take her places and
Yes, ma'am.
the child places? And what was your habit in terms of getting her child to daycare?
We took him to different places, his grandmother's, to the daycare center in Parsons, a couple different places.
Well, on April the 13th, do you remember where he was going at that time?
Yeah, we were taking him to his grandmother's in Perry County.
His grandmother's in what county?
Perry County.
Perry County. Now, do you remember something that sort of interrupted the morning routine with getting you and your ex-wife and the child to the right places? Did something happen?
Yeah.
Would you tell the jury, because they want to hear it?
Okay. About 7:50, sometime like that, I heard some arguing going on next door. So I kind of looked through the trees to see what was going on and couldn't see anything at all. And she started screaming a little, and then she quit. And my girlfriend came outside, so I told her to get in the truck, and we went down and we sat at the end of the driveway for a few minutes and didn't see or hear anything, so we went ahead and went on to work.
All right. Before we go any further, were you were outside when you first heard the screaming?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you remember what you heard or what words you heard?
It sounded like she was arguing with somebody, and she said stop. I said stop.
Stop, I said stop.
Yeah.
Okay. And at that, when you heard that, did it sound frantic to you, or did you just think someone was messing around?
It sounded like she was arguing with somebody she knew. I mean, it didn't sound nothing serious, really. I mean.
At that point?
Yeah.
Okay, did something happen, or did you hear additional screams later that made you actually walk to the tree line?
Yeah, she kind of cut out mid-scream, and it just didn't sound right. And my dogs were raising Cain, so I kind of went over there to see what was going on. And like I said, I couldn't see anything from where I was at.
How long did the screaming last?
Maybe a minute and a half. I mean.
And other than no and stop, did you hear, and you said her, did it sound like it was a female's voice?
Yeah.
Other than the no and the stop, did you hear any other words?
No.
Got an answer?
No.
Thank you. All right, now you said that you finished loading up your car with your ex-wife and the child, and that you went down your driveway, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And went to the base of Bobo's driveway?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you actually turn up in the driveway?
Just barely. I just kind of pulled my truck up in there and stopped.
Okay, did you pull your truck up in it but still aiming like you were going to be driving down the road, or did you pull it up facing the house?
Yeah, I actually pulled up facing the house.
Okay, and how long did you sit there?
About 2 or 3 minutes.
Did you hear anything else?
Nothing. We turned the engine off. There were no vehicles, no nothing.
So at that point, you didn't have anything to worry about, I guess?
Well, I thought so.
I'm sorry?
I thought so.
Okay, and so then you continue on your way?
Well, we left, and we made it to Parsons, and which is about 4 or 5 minutes away. And me and my girlfriend just wouldn't drop it, so we called my mom and had her call Miss Karen.
You said you called your mom. Did you ask your mom whether or not she had heard anything?
Yeah, I asked her if she had heard them arguing earlier that morning.
And had she?
No.
And you said you had your mom ask your mom to call Miss Karen. Did you know where Miss Karen worked?
Yes.
And your mom used to work there as well?
Yes, and my previous ex-wife.
Okay. Your previous ex-wife.
Yeah.
So everybody kind of knew everybody. All right.
Number 2.
And after giving your mother or telling your mother that information, did you go into work?
Yes.
And later on in the day, did you, I guess, receive some information that you thought was probably related to what you heard?
Yeah, the TBI said that they needed me to come home because they had to question me immediately.
You got to speak up.
The TBI told me that I had to come home because they had to question me immediately.
Okay. And did you do that?
Yes.
All right.
I got there at 11:50.
And I think it's pretty obvious from the fact that who you're with and the baby, and you dropped the baby off, took your ex-wife to work and were on the job, but you didn't have anything to do with what happened to Holly Bobo.
No, ma'am.
Right. Just you happened to have heard something, told your mom, and your mom called care of Bobo.
Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. We are watching the testimony of the neighbor here, Michael, who heard screams and saw some of the sort of background information that went on regarding this crime, but he didn't know it was a crime at the time. How effective do you think this testimony was for the prosecution?
It's good. I mean, it's as I mentioned before, it's a punctuation on the timeline. This was the morning that things started going a little crazy, and Holly Bobo was last heard from.
Right.
So we have a witness testifying to sometimes 7:30, 7:40 in the morning, hearing these screams, and actually he gets more detailed than that. It's sort of an argument that results in a scream that is then kind of cut off.
That's
you know, a stifled scream. That's pretty dramatic stuff. And then he calls his mom calls Holly Bobo's mom, and it really sets into motion a number of important events.
That's absolutely right. And it shows sort of the community there, that everyone knows each other and that everyone is sort of tuned into what's going on with one another, which certainly sort of belies the impact that this case had on that community. If you're the attorney who's preparing for Dylan Adams' trial, is this witness one that you're focused on or not so much?
He's important because he does begin that series of events, and it is a punctuation in the timeline, but he's not as important.
Right.
If you elongate that timeline, the things happening in the latter portion of the timeline just before the shooting of Holly Bobo, critical stuff.
Absolutely.
This is necessary. I'm not going to belabor it.
Well, and that's the thing. If you're looking at who you're going to cross and where are you going to focus your cross-examination and your time so that you're not sort of boring the jury, for me, this witness would not be, I mean, sure, he's compelling and he's certainly laying the scene for the jury, but I'm not worried about looking at every word for cross-examination because it doesn't really matter if he was off on a couple things. It doesn't impact whether or not my client's guilty.
No, not at all. Not at all.
Yeah, it's testimony that I do think we'll hear again in the next trial because we have to remember that though we've heard it, that jury will not have heard it and will need to hear it. But if I am Dylan's attorney, I don't know how much I'd be examining him.
Yeah, and remember, we didn't talk about the makeup of the jury, but this is going to be a new jury, obviously. A shipped-in jury, not from the area.
That's right.
Which maybe is helpful in keeping them sanitized, and maybe they didn't hear anything about this witness or others. So they really have to paint a new picture for them.
Right, starting completely from scratch and yet using anything they can from the first trial. And as we go through witnesses, there will be some witnesses who are more well used, I think,
yes,
by Dylan's defense attorney. We are preparing for our special segment at about 1:30. One of our guests is here in the studio, another will be Skyping in, and we'll be talking about revenge porn. In the news last week, Representative Congressman from Texas was the victim, arguably, of revenge porn. Some pictures that he had sent to a woman that he was in a relationship with became public, and that sort of led us here at Law and Crime Network to want to explore what are the laws in the various states. He's a congressman, lives part-time in D.C., part-time in Texas. Are the laws there the same? Is there a federal law? Should there be? What are our laws getting better or worse for victims? What exactly is revenge porn, and what are the First Amendment rights that go along with putting pictures out there? And we're going to be talking to two women who themselves were victims of this type of behavior. Very strong, very brave of them to come out here and talk about what happened to them. And they do this, both of them, to help other people who have been the victims of this type of behavior. So, and Michael's going to stick around with us so that we can also address the legalities of this, because it is really, I mean, I did a lot of research over the weekend, Michael. It is a lot.
It is. It's the morphing of what really was civil law into criminal is pretty interesting.
And the way that DAs and prosecutors can use other laws in places where there aren't revenge porn laws to sort of go after these people, and the copyright ideas and the civil, there's a lot
First
to
Amendment,
discuss. There's all kinds
yeah.
of, it's a law school exam waiting
yes,
to happen,
it is.
but it
Can't
also
wait for
has
that.
very personal and a strong impact. One of our guest is already
The
here.
setting is just the most emotional.
It
yes.
really is. It really is. And we're going to talk about all of that at about 1:30. So stick with us. We're going to go back to another clip of the Holly Bobo case. Please send in your questions. I'll do my best to answer them while we're having this conversation. We're going to have a lot of people here talking, but we want to include you in that conversation as well. So bring on your questions. Some of you already have, and I've been trying to write those down. And we'll be back with you at about 1:30.